Jeff's comment about there being breakfast, lunch, and dinner over there just kind of goes along with my constant learning curve about what food is in Wisconsin. When I got here 10 years ago, I'd been at Wade House about a week when I got assigned a group of volunteers and a room full of books and told, do something with them. So we went out and we were digging through the books and we decided to make an Excel spreadsheet of these things before we moved them to another location. And we ran across this book published by the Wisconsin Historical Society, my employer, called The Flavors of Wisconsin. So I flipped the thing open and the first chapter it falls open to is meatless main dishes. The first recipe is meatless spaghetti and the first ingredient is a 1/4 pound of bacon. I kind of looked at this and I looked at the people I was working with and said something about it and they looked at me like I was stupid. I said, this is Wisconsin. Bacon's a condiment. And it goes from there. But we're here tonight to talk about several other things, and I'm just going to pick on Jeff. If any of you don't want to volunteer here, I have opportunities at Wade House. It's a little bit of a drive, but you know, you can do both, yeah. So, but tonight we're here to talk about plank roads and railroads, two of the early forms of transportation here in Wisconsin. And we're going to be jumping around a little bit. First thing we're going to do is go back to a few years before statehood, and the United States looks a little different at this point. The Southwest is actually Mexico. Texas is an independent nation. I know they still think they are, but Wisconsin, where's my big red, oh, it's bouncing off on the roof, is that big red blob, and we're not yet a state. Over half of America is managed by territorial governments or has no government at all, or to use the technical term, is unorganized. And the frontier, the concept of the frontier, is very much part of the national consciousness. Wisconsin itself, we're at a point where statehood's possible. We've got enough people, we've got enough organization, but the wilderness still begins right outside your back door. Large portions of the state remain unsettled and undeveloped, and infrastructure is virtually non-existent. We have very few easy travel routes available. Rivers, streams, and lakes serve as trade routes. They also serve as sources of food. The French courier de bois used these waterways to get to the native villages. Many of the routes used for trade and transportation back then are still used today. We also have some overland routes, but traveling them can be rather problematic. Early explorers had to travel on foot through forest, over prairies, and with pack animals. We have dense vegetation, we have steep hills, we have valleys, we have river crossings, and we have lakes to circumnavigate. And that's just where the roads are. We also have animal paths. So clearing paths is not always necessary. You can use the animal paths, especially those left by large mammals like deer and bison. Native Americans also created some pathways, so those could be used. And the European settlers and explorers did use both. Crossing forests and prairies with wagons, though, required skill and a whole lot of labor. Wide, flat roads were needed for wagons to cross, and those prairie grasses can be anywhere from 4 to 8 feet tall. And I mentioned that you could get animal tracks created by bison. Well, there weren't a whole lot of bison in Wisconsin, so a lot of times you had to cut trails through the dense vegetation. When you're doing this through a forest, it required a lot of effort. Path building meant cutting trees and brush. It meant removing debris. A lot of times they just cut them down and left the stumps in the middle of the roadbed, and progress could generally be less than a mile a day. To help with this, a lot of states passed what were called internal improvement acts, which provided incentives and funding to build better transportation routes. The only problem was some states went a little too far and put themselves almost in bankruptcy. Fortunately, Wisconsin was smart enough to put a rule in their law that said you can't overspend on this and put Wisconsin in bankruptcy. But a lot of these acts did fail. They overextended state treasuries and left projects unfinished, and the travelers and residents no better off than they were before. Well, somebody came up with an idea for how to fix this problem. The first roads we had around were often just like this, 2 ruts in the ground with vegetation removed in the middle. Sometimes there were stumps in the middle. These evolved into dirt roads, wide enough for 1, maybe 2 horses to go abreast. They were passable only in the dry summer months and the winter freeze, because during the spring thaw and the autumn rains, we grew one of Wisconsin's best crops, mud. And wet clay can pull a wagon in, it can pull a horse in something fierce. Rescuing wagons often meant unloading the wagon, hooking up extra horses, pulling it out, unhooking the extra horses, reloading the wagon. And that is a lot of work, especially while you're stuck in the mud. Conditions sometimes brought commerce and travel to a dead standstill, and new roads were desperately needed. Newspapers used road conditions to promote or denigrate commerce and settlement areas. One of encouraged locals to support proposed improvements to the Sheboygan-Fond du Lac Road and construction of a road into the interior of the state, the idea being to increase business at the port in Sheboygan. Now, other newspapers had other ideas, such as the Green Bay Advocate. They like to use the press to draw people to their city by making derogatory comments about Sheboygan, especially the road to Sheboygan. Paper called the road among the worst of the bad ones. But my favorite comment is of rocks not laid down on any chart, among which a snake could not wind without getting a cracked head. I'm thinking some alcohol was involved in coming up with that one. Well, there were a lot of roads built regardless of what the Green Bay Advocate thought about them. Sometimes they were used for anybody that wanted to use them. Sometimes they were military roads, and other times they had a specific twist toward perhaps a stagecoach using them. There was a road that ran between Sheboygan and Fond du Lac, 42 miles, and the stagecoaches that ran on this road were the only commercial passenger transportation between those two cities at this time, and we're talking the early 1840s to mid-1840s. The stage ran twice a day between Sheboygan and Fond du Lac. They used the income generated for themselves and businesses along the stage route. So the stage did, it had its place. It did good things. And it was a great thing because it ran like clockwork. Every morning, it left Sheboygan promptly at 8 a.m. Every evening, the stage line left Sheboygan after the boat got in from Green Bay, or from Milwaukee, whenever that may be, because it wasn't always on time. But it was still kind of a rough road. So we needed improved and better roads for those stagecoaches and for everybody else, because as you know, improved roads lead to smoother rides, better and consistent scheduled service, which of course generally means more customers. Also, we had a lot of European immigrants coming to Wisconsin during this time. New and improved transportation routes were needed to get the immigrants from the eastern cities, the port cities, into the interior of the state. Plank roads and railroads increased speed. They increased the ease of travel to the interior of the state and helped us settle our state. For many businessmen and politicians looking for an answer to how to fix these roads, the answer came from up north, Canada. Canada had this really bizarre idea, which was, let's take wooden planks and cover the roads with them. Crossways. Well, a lot of Americans traveling in Canada saw this, thought it was a good idea, and that it would revolutionize rural transportation, so they brought the idea back to the U.S. By the way, the Canadians did not charge a tariff at the border for this. One of the truly popular things about the plank road. Today, 1840s, no real difference. It's new, it's technology, therefore we like it. Others, not necessarily as interested in technology and cool new things, were interested in the money to be made from road construction and the tolls charged on the roads, because plank roads were toll roads. We'll get into that more later. So in 1844, a representative from the U.S. investigates the roads in Canada and makes a recommendation on whether this technology should be brought to America. At the same time, some folks from the New York State Assembly went up to Canada, and they wrote a special report on plank road companies forming in northwest New York. The report found that planks had been in use in Canada for nearly a decade and would benefit New York. So Canadian plank roads followed a business model, like I just mentioned, of allowing private companies to build and operate the roads. So in the U.S., building new roads and improving roads usually meets with a shortage of funding, just like today. So a lot of governments thought, private business, somebody else pays for the roads that we get to use. Yeah, let's do that. The plank road companies funded their own projects. They became popular due to low construction cost, easy availability of materials, and quality of the road service. So the plank road companies would issue their own stock to raise money and advertise and really say nice things about how great their roads were. Like, they're smooth as a billiard table, and driving on a plank road is like gliding across a carpet on the floor of a ballroom. I think these guys also invented marketing. Now, plank roads are really easy to build. They don't require a lot of skill. Basically, the way this works is you have 2 rows of what are called stringers, also called sleepers. Those are the vertical boards you see there. They're about 8 inches square, and you take them and you lay them on the ground, end to end, about 6 feet apart. Then the next row, the horizontal boards, are called stringers. They're about 8 feet long. They lay across the boards, or across the stringers. You just get a bunch of guys, everybody grabs a board, you go lay it in place, kick it up next to the one next to it, he walks away, the next guy does the same, you're laying road like that. Now, you're all looking at me and I can see in your eyes going, what about the nails? There were no nails. After they set a bunch of the boards down, they'd go along with shovels, they pile a bunch of dirt on the end of them to keep them from moving. That way, if a board broke, all you had to do is dig it out, take out the broken one, lay down a new one, throw the dirt back over it. So these things were inexpensive to build. You're paying for labor, you're paying for wood. And you can lay down a lot of road in one day. Now, of course, this being the United States, there was a lot of fuss. What is the right way to build a plank road? On those stringers, the vertical ones, do we just lay them on the ground, or do we dig a trench and put it down in the trench so that just the top of it is at ground level, then we put the stretchers across it? Well, eventually somebody will write an instruction manual, which was not free. You had to buy it. Was there really any advantage to one over the other? One style over the other? Not really. Boards broke just as easily. Sometimes they would put gravel on the planks to allow a little bit of extra traction. You could also use dirt, stone, but the bottom line is anything like this that's sitting on top of wood that gets enough water on it gets gooey or washes away. Now I have a question for you in a moment, so get ready to answer. The plank roads were 8 feet wide. They sat next to an 8-foot wide dirt road. Traffic was allowed to travel on the plank road in both directions. So, my question for you is, when 2 wagons are going opposite directions on the plank road and they get to the same place at the same time, Who has to get off onto the dirt side of the road, which could be the mud side of the road? I hear smallest one? The empty one? You're actually fairly close. Any other guesses? Any guesses as to what the school kids think? Number one answer from school kids, fight to the death. Followed very closely by the number two answer, whoever has the prettiest horse. The actual answer to the question is most counties had a law in place determining who had the right of way. In Sheboygan County, it was the eastbound vehicle. The logic behind this was that the eastbound vehicle would be loaded with goods from the farm and on its way to the port in Sheboygan. They, of course, didn't take into account that the westbound vehicles had already been to the port in Sheboygan, unloaded, and brought a whole bunch of other stuff that they put in the wagon and were taking home. So, I'm not sure they truly solved the problem.
Tim, did they have weight limits and things? Those look like pretty big wagons and pretty...
I am going to defer answering that question for a few minutes.
I'm sorry.
And well, you'll see why when it comes around. There were a lot of plank roads in Wisconsin. I think we had about 325 miles of them. The first one completed was the Milwaukee to Waterton plank road, completed in 1853. A lot of people still consider these roads to be experimental. But, you know, they were very popular in the Midwest. People were very interested. 4 states, including Wisconsin, established standardized procedures for the legislature to give a plank road company a charter. And here you can see just some comparative numbers of the number of plank road companies in various states. So you can see we had 130 companies. Now, not all of those actually completed roads, and a lot of them just changed their names several times and got new charters, so there weren't really necessarily 130 companies working on roads at any given time. But Merchant Magazine in 1847 said every section of the country should be lined with roads and that plank roads are of the class of canals and railways. So these things were getting a lot of press. And in Wisconsin, we liked that press. We built them all over the eastern part of the state. Out by Fond du Lac to Oshkosh, Sheboygan to Green Bay, Sheboygan to Manitowoc, Sheboygan to Milwaukee, Sheboygan to Fondy, Watertown, the one we just mentioned, Milwaukee to Watertown. They were everywhere. And there are a lot of them that the names still remain today. So if you keep an eye out, the roads are still there. They're not covered with planks anymore. They're modern. But we have continued to use those routes. I mentioned earlier that somebody wrote a plank road construction manual because plank roads were regional, and of course every region had different ideas on how to build them. Most companies built a single road and managed it. Local citizens promoted, financed, and controlled the regional companies. They utilized local newspapers and public meetings to sell stock and raise capital, and construction work progressed outward from the largest towns and the most important towns served by the road toward the interior. A little bit of a difference in our end of the world down there in Sheboygan County is they did start building from Sheboygan and Fond du Lac at the same time, although it ended up being finished from the Sheboygan side west. Fondy kind of gave up a bit. You could purchase stock in the company, and the companies attempted to sell stock to their friends and investors and anybody else they could get money from. It usually sold slowly, seldom for cash. In other words, I'll give you stock in my company if you give me a wagon load of boards. So in some ways, you didn't get paid for your boards. In many cases, the company stock took the place of cash, as we just mentioned. But the plank roads, people bought into them because they were important. They did 4 primary things. Number 1, they made money for owners and investors. They usually raised more money than they needed for construction costs. We'll get to that in a minute. They helped improve commerce in the towns they served. And they generated money through the collection of tolls. These were all private roads. They were toll roads. And those tolls were supposed to provide money for maintenance and also dividends for the investors. Now, how much does it cost to build a plank road? Not a lot. Labor, about 70 cents a guy per day. You can get boards really cheap, 10, 12 bucks a thousand. So, our road from Sheboygan to Fondy was allowed to raise more money by their charter than it cost to build the road. They were allowed to raise $150,000. It only cost them $60,000 to build it. So they started, right off the bat with $90,000 in their pocket, not including what they were going to make off the tolls. And I have now lost my place in my notes. So we're going to move on here to just a list of some of the plank road companies here in the state. You can see we had quite a few. Plymouth to Waupun, Plymouth to Saukville Turnpike, Calumet Village and Sheboygan, Sheboygan and Fondy, Sheboygan and Mayville. So quite a bit going on here. And it only took about 2 years to build the road from Sheboygan to Fondy, 42 miles. And one of the great things here is along the way, people were building some businesses like the Wade House. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Wade House, we sit exactly halfway between Sheboygan and Fond du Lac on the plank road. Now, Sylvanus Wade, who built the Wade House, also founded Greenbush, saw the benefits of the road when he started hearing about it. By the way, I can tell you that right about where that green line stops at the bottom, that's where the plank road passed the Wade House. So it was very much beneficial to his business, his hotel, his restaurant, his tavern, and his land sales to have that plank road come past. So Wade got involved in the company. I mentioned that people sold these to their friends. He was a promoter, an investor, a company officer, a subscription agent, a member of the board of directors, and on top of that, would sell you land along the side of the road. So he was quite involved in all this, as were many other people. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago that the road started in some of the bigger cities and worked toward the smaller ones. In Sheboygan County, as I said, they started building in Fondy, they started building in Sheboygan, working toward each other. Fond du Lac, anybody here from Fondy? Oh, good, I can say what I want. Fondy slacked on them and backed out and left Sheboygan to handle dealing with everything. So the Sheboygan side paid for and built the road all the way to Fond du Lac, and we're not seeing this concept for the last time tonight. Sheboygan County also pledged support for the road, county dollars. We've already talked about it. It took about 2 years to build the whole road, and it was completed by July of 1852. Now, as we mentioned, this was a toll road. So the really cool thing is when you own the road, you can put as many toll booths on there as you want. You can put them wherever you want. You can invent the Pennsylvania Turnpike if you want. So toll booths were located along the road. This one is very fancy. We got a toll house. We got a fancy gate across the road. Some of them were just a log on the road that they would spin out of the way when you paid your toll. So all completely based on whatever the owners of the company wanted to do. Fortunately, they did set pretty standardized toll fees, and they were based on the type of traffic. A vehicle drawn by 2 horses was 2 cents a mile. 1 horse was 1 cent a mile. 3 was 3 cents. You get the picture. You could also move things like livestock, and they were half a cent a mile apiece. Unless you were moving sheep and swine, then you paid half a cent a mile for 10 animals, because I guess they're smaller. Going to church or home from church on Sunday, or going to and from your military service were free. So not everyone had to pay, and some people chose not to pay even when they were supposed to. Some people would go around the toll booth. This is an act called shumpking, which makes me think that it happened fairly often if they took the effort to make a name for it. Well, here's the cool part. If you were the toll booth employee and you caught somebody shumpking, you could go after them and fine them, and you got to keep the fine. So there was incentive there from the employees to go after them. And, you know, for somebody who makes $50 to $200 a year, a little extra money is not a bad thing. There were other ways to get it too. Embezzlement was a bit of a problem among the employees of the toll booths. The average toll booth brought in $4,500 a year. The average toll keeper, as I said, made $50 to $200, so sometimes they helped themselves. Now, sir, you asked about, was there a weight limit? The answer is yes. And this is part of the reason why. Because the Sheboygan to Fond du Lac Railroad Company, which we'll get to in the next part of our program, bought 2 locomotives, and they had them landed at Sheboygan. They hooked them up to about 40 horses, mules, and oxen, and drug them 42 miles across the plank road. And probably don't need to tell you that that caused a little bit of damage. There's a little bit better look at the road, or at the locomotive. It weighed about 15 tons. So they laid extra wooden planks on the road to create some rails for those wheels to roll on and reinforce it a bit. Took 6 weeks to drag it 45 miles and caused very severe damage to the road. The railroad company bought 2 locomotives, remember? So the plank road company tried to tell them, you're not taking that second one across our road. However, state law said anything pulled by horses, mules, or oxen may travel on the plank road. So kind of did some serious damage that led to the eventual downfall of the plank road itself. Fondy, of course, being located at the lower tip of Lake Winnebago, served as a hub for several of the plank roads, as you saw on our map a while back. The Sheboygan-Fondy Plank Road planned to extend its road from Fondy to Ripon, Ceresco, and Fox River. The Fond du Lac to Oshkosh Plank Road ran along the western edge of Lake Winnebago, continued through to Friendship, and Fondy County did see the importance of linking Oshkosh and Fondy, so in 1854 they passed bonds to fund a road with public money, but unfortunately the plank road companies got their roads built and they didn't take a couple of things into consideration. Number one was the climate difference between Canada and the Midwestern United States. It's warmer here, it's wetter here, and those conditions allow wood to deteriorate more quickly than it does in an area like Canada where things stay frozen more of the year. So the roads in Wisconsin lasted less than 5 years. But that's okay, because we've got that money left in the bank from when we built it. You know, we raised that extra 90 grand to fix the road, right? Yep. Funny, when they went to repair those roads, that money wasn't there. I'm not pointing a finger at anybody. Make your own decisions. So the roads didn't get repaired. And over time, the companies either handed them over to the counties, abandoned them completely, and the plank road era in Wisconsin lasted about 10 years. So not only was the weather part of the downfall, but there was kind of something funky going on that made them a little bit less attractive. And that funky thing was the railroad. So we're going to now step away from plank roads and move forward into the era of the railroad, which actually started long before the plank road movement. Started a good decade before statehood, because in 1830, the Baltimore and Ohio opened and became the first steam railroad in the country. A year later, Henry Rowe Schoolcraft visited the Western Michigan Territory, also called Wisconsin. His journey led him throughout the state through granite outcroppings, lakes, pine forests in northern Wisconsin, wetlands, prairies, deciduous forests in the southern part of the state. He traveled by horse, he traveled by water, and these experiences in the mining region of his trip led him to recommend using railroads and steamboats to transport ore. Now, this is 1830, 31, remind you, so it took about 20 years before a railroad became a reality in Wisconsin, but people didn't forget about him during that time. By 1848, the territorial legislature had granted charters to 9 railroad companies. However, none of them started construction at all, usually caused by difficulties from the Panic of 1837, which was, everybody freaking out that there might be a recession. But developing agriculture in the 1840s changed that. Wisconsin grew enough wheat to export to the eastern U.S., and only a railroad had the capacity to move that grain from the interior of the state to the hub in Chicago, to the ports on the eastern shore, and get that grain to market while it was still good. So we need railroads. And the first one to actually be completed and be operational is going to be the Milwaukee and Waukesha Railroad Company, which got its charter in February of 1847. Now we're going to use the Milwaukee and Waukesha tonight to discuss how a railroad was built. So if there are those of you who like railroads and like railroad history, I'm going to warn you right now. I'm going to go through this, and we're going to see this company change names at least 4 times. So, Milwaukee and Waukesha, or M&W, is going to become Wisconsin's first successful railroad. We're going to illustrate the process that the companies had to follow. Their charter permitted them to build a line from Milwaukee to Waukesha, to Madison, to the Mississippi River in Grant County. And the new companies had to meet a minimum of 3 times prior to beginning construction. The first meeting was the formation of the company and a request for a charter. The second meeting was an appointment of commissioners, the people who sold the stock, and the opening of the books. They had to sell a set number of shares to prove their viability to the legislature before they could begin construction. The third meeting opened stock sales to raise the remaining capital. When all these steps were completed, construction could finally begin. Stock investments were one way to get the money you needed. We're going to go through a few here. Private investors, farmers, tradesmen, and businessmen bought shares of stock. You can get land grants from the U.S. government. These provided land at no cost to the company. And these usually were the result of some political patronage. You can get county funding. State and local government can provide money based on anticipated benefits to local businesses. They can be grants, they can be low interest loans. The banks in the eastern U.S. sold stocks and bonds to finance rail lines in distant parts of the country, including Wisconsin. So, you got all your rich people in the east helping finance it. So, to go back to our Milwaukee and Waukesha, just to give you some dates, the first meeting was held in November of 1847, where they elected their officers. In February of 1848, the stocks went on sale. And in 1849, they met their stock sales goal and changed their name to the Milwaukee, Waukesha, and Mississippi Railroad. Now, not everybody was happy about this. The announcement of a Milwaukee Railroad caused concern among some segments of the business community. There was fear there would be a monopoly, and people argued that the rail system would benefit farmers but injure the businessmen. Residents along the track's route felt that those towns that got depots would be successful, and the railroad not stopping in their town could destroy their town. And others thought that the state would put too much money into it and go bankrupt. However, Wisconsin, as I mentioned earlier with the Internal Improvements Act, had the foresight to pass a law saying they couldn't spend so much that they would go broke. However, that law didn't apply to cities or counties. And over the next decade, cities and counties would invest in rail lines. As an example, in 1849, the city of Milwaukee invested $100,000 in our railroad and later increased that to $250,000. They got their money, and in October of 1849, construction began. And we are going to build our railroad from Milwaukee westward. We're going to do it in 5 segments. Milwaukee to Waukesha, Waukesha to Rock River to Madison. Here's my favorite, Madison to somewhere near Mineral Point. And finally, somewhere near Mineral Point to Grant County. And this is going to be a lot of work because building a railroad has several labor-intensive steps. You have to clear land. You have to grade or level. You have to lay gravel. You have to dig cuts through hills. You have to lay the ties and the rails. And the first 20 miles of our Milwaukee, Waukesha, and Madison Railroad took a year and a half to build. And we're going to have a little problem here. I understand you guys have a railroad depot and you have model trains. Do all your model trains run on the same size track? No, neither do real trains. They built the MW&M on broad gauge rails, 6 feet between the rails. Standard gauge rail of the time was 4 foot 8.5, which is still used today, by the way. So as we go through time and want our railroads to merge and work with other railroads, we're going to have to readjust our rails, which also means getting new locomotives. Here is our Milwaukee and Mississippi Railroad poster. They did have financial problems, which led to them to change their name. And the Milwaukee, Waukesha, and Mississippi became the Milwaukee and Mississippi Railroad in February of 1850. The company worked with the state to create a law that allowed farmers to put up land as collateral for railroad investments, which they used to buy 2 locomotives and ship them from Schenectady, New York, across the Great Lakes to Milwaukee, where they arrived in September of 1850. Letting people mortgage their land to invest in something is a dangerous, dangerous practice. Here's our first engine in Milwaukee. On February 25, 1851, the Milwaukee and Mississippi opened for business. The inaugural trip is going to go from Milwaukee to Waukesha. There will be band music, there will be speeches, there will be dinner, and a round-trip train ride. $2.50 for this party, by the way. A typical ride would cost you 75 cents each way. So you can see what some of the standard pricing is. Not too bad when you consider that a trip on the stagecoach from Sheboygan to Fond du Lac costs you about $2. You're saving some serious money here and moving a whole lot faster. For that inaugural ride, there were over 200 riders, 500 spectators along the tracks. The line was successful and quickly began to generate income for the investors, and other areas of the state quickly joined the list of towns hoping for railroad service. In the 1840, land around Janesville, Fort Atkinson, and Beloit developed into wheat-producing zones, and a rail line was needed to get that wheat to market. By 1847, the Galena and Chicago Railroad wanted to expand into southern Wisconsin. They planned to build a branch from Rockford, Illinois, along the Rock River up to Beloit. Plans expanded to add a line connecting Janesville and Madison. By mid-1848, investors wanted to expand that service to Watertown and Fondy. The new line offered the opportunity to pick up Lake Winnebago's commercial traffic at Fondy and move it southward by rail. This is the inside of a passenger car, kind of a fancy one. Two companies emerged to build the line from Beloit to points north. The Madison and Beloit Railroad Company charter permitted them to build from Beloit to Madison via Janesville. The Beloit-Taycheedah Railroad Company's charter allowed construction between the two cities. You guys all know where Taycheedah is? Okay. The Beloit and Madison got its charter amended, allowing it to extend northward from Madison to any point on the Wisconsin River. And of course, at that time, they changed their name to the Rock River Valley Union Railroad Company. I think they're going to see who gets the longest name. A further amendment permitted extension from Janesville to Lake Winnebago by way of Fort Atkinson, Jefferson, and Watertown. The same route that we mentioned a minute ago being allotted to Beloit and Taycheedah Railroad. That led to a little hard feelings. So what eventually happened is Beloit and Taycheedah got absorbed by the Rock River Valley Union Railroad. Another change to their charter permitted them to extend to Lake Superior, La Crosse, Willow River, and St. Croix. So we got one little railroad company that suddenly has a lot of land it's allowed to cover. Construction is going to begin on July 10, 1851. They're going to build a station and shops on the west bank of the Fond du Lac River, and this station is something. It's got a depot, shanties, a blacksmith shop, a carpenter shop, everything you need to move quickly and build a railroad. And in 1852, the first shipment of rails shows up in Fondy. They came overland from Green Bay to the northern end of Lake Winnebago, got loaded on a barge, floated down to the southern end, and unloaded and taken to the work area. They were quickly installed in that broad gauge line we mentioned, which was chosen specifically because heavier locomotives and wider cars were thought to be more efficient in carrying freight and passengers. So what we're going to have here is our Rock River Valley Union line. And they ordered the two locomotives we talked about earlier. We won't go back across that. But the first locomotive, so you know, was the Winnebago. And it was put into service moving construction materials from the rail yard to the work zones. But the Rock River Valley Union quickly fell on hard times. By 1855, its finances were stretched to the breaking point, and their president, William Ogden, President of the Illinois and Wisconsin Railroad, William Ogden, purchased the Rock River and merged it with the Illinois and Wisconsin. And the road became known as the Chicago, St. Paul, and Fond du Lac System. The merger created a firm whose rails covered a huge area in east central Wisconsin. But due to the mixed gauge line, they had to spend quite a bit of money and time resizing all those rails so that you can fit standard gauge locomotives and rolling stock on them. And what we're going to end up doing is taking those two very expensive broad gauge railroad engines and we're going to send them back east and let somebody else deal with them. And there we are. Locomotive goes bye-bye. In 1859, just a few years later, the Rock River Valley Union becomes part of the Chicago Northwestern Rail Company, which is going to last until the late 20th century. But Fondy wasn't the only one that wanted a railroad. Oshkosh decided to get in on the game too and provide a rail hub on the eastern edge of Lake Winnebago. The town started a rail project shortly after incorporation, and in 1853, two railroad companies formed in Oshkosh, the Oshkosh and Portage City and the Winnebago Railroad Company. Oshkosh built a lovely depot when the town common council voted to extend financial aid to the railroad, making it possible to build the tracks. So by 1859, they had completed a line connecting Oshkosh and Fondy, where the first passenger train ran on October 13th. And unfortunately, there was a bit of an accident. And a lot of excitement. There was a celebrity excursion to Chicago, but tragedy struck on the way. The accident happened near Watertown, killed 5 of Oshkosh's prominent citizens, and plunged the entire town into mourning. The line was acquired by Chicago and Northwestern soon after. Several years later, in 1871, we started seeing more rail lines come through Oshkosh. They kind of stepped away from railroads for a while after the accident. And in 71, a 19-mile spur connected Oshkosh to Ripon. And almost 10 years later, a line ran from Oshkosh to Hortonville, connected to the Milwaukee, Lakeshore, and Western Railway, which became part of the Chicago and Northwestern. That's now our theme. Everything becomes part of the Chicago and Northwestern. Wisconsin Central extended its railway south from Neenah in 1882, and that new route passed through Oshkosh, Milwaukee, and eventually down to Chicago. No fewer than 3 railroads served Oshkosh in the mid to late 19th century, some of them at the same time, some of them successively. And, of course, Sheboygan has to get in on the deal. So we're going to start looking up again at the idea of building a railroad from Sheboygan to Fond du Lac, because Sheboygan in the 1840s and 1850s really saw itself as being in competition with Milwaukee to see who was going to become that major western port and on the Lake Michigan and become the port for everything coming to the western United States. You get one guess who won. Some people even thought it'd be a great eastern terminus for a transcontinental railway leading all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And Sheboygan really was a good idea. It was 110 miles, or you saved 110 miles over going from Milwaukee, because you'd have to go up from Milwaukee to Sheboygan. You were 200 miles from Chicago, so you could, come straight to Sheboygan, get on that new fancy transcontinental railroad and not have to unload everything in Chicago and transport it up to Sheboygan. But not everybody thought Sheboygan was the best place for it. They'd have to settle for some smaller stakes. The Sheboygan and Fond du Lac Railroad Company received their charter in 1847. They designated a route to connect the two cities, and it would stop in Plymouth and Glenbeulah along the way. And really, guys, I'm hoping there was more to Glenbeulah back then if they were going to stop the train there. Right now, it's a post office, a gas station, and a sports bar. We lost our bank during COVID. The charter gave the company 5 years to begin construction, 15 years to complete it. If they failed to build the road in the allotted time, their charter would be forfeit. And once again, Fondy supported their pledge initially, but lost interest in the project. And in 1852, that 5-year deadline arrived with no visible progress on the rails, and the company went under. But from the ashes comes the Sheboygan and Mississippi Railroad Company, and the boosters of this new road pointed out it was closer to eastern markets than either Milwaukee or Chicago, just like the last guys did. And they thought that their western terminus, instead of being the Pacific, should merely be St. Paul, Minnesota. The stock sold pretty well in Sheboygan County, but Fond du Lac County continued to point its interest in other directions. But in Sheboygan, they were successful, and groundbreaking took place in June of 1856. And unfortunately, the tracks didn't make it to Plymouth until 1859, so they weren't moving real quick. Credit was available. Cash was difficult to obtain. And we talked about this with stock earlier. A lot of things that the railroad needed were paid for with scrip tickets. So basically, you got a ticket that indicated you had given a half a quart of wood or a quart of lard oil or 50 railroad ties that eventually you hoped you would be compensated for. A lot of people never saw their money. But we do have some shipping documents. The new line connecting the two cities put all the stage lines out of business, which meant all the freight was now going by rail. And passage from Glen Beulah to Fond du Lac on a stage, as I mentioned, was $2. That same trip on the railroad was 48 cents, and a whole lot faster. So during the life of the Sheboygan and FDL Railroad, fares increased from 2 to 3 cents per mile. So it did get a little bit more expensive. And continued on for about 25 or 30 years. Now, where things did get to be a bit of a problem was when they planned the route. Because a lot of the people that were supporting the railroad and out selling stock for it and trying to get it to come through lived in some of those towns that got bypassed. And one of those was Mr. Wade and Greenbush. The plank road had gone through Greenbush. The railroad bypassed it for a very simple reason. There's a big hill along the plank road between Sheboygan and Plymouth. And it was cheaper and easier to build the railroad 2 miles out of the way and go through Glen Beulah rather than Greenbush than it was to cut through that hill. Greenbush is not a big town today, but I can tell you that there are a lot of people there who are still mad that the railroad didn't come through. Because it pretty much killed the town. We're a very small town today. We have 3 businesses. We have Wade House Historic Site. We have a guy who sells and installs pickup truck camper covers. And we have a Pepsi machine. Actually, technically it's RC, but. So it really, from a town that had a main street with dry goods stores, and I hear 4 years before I got here, in 2014, Greenbush still had 4 restaurants and bars. By the time I got here, nothing. Oh, I'm sorry, we do have a feed mill. So as you can see from where we've been today, plank roads and railroads both serve their purpose in Wisconsin. They represent different ends of the technological spectrum. Some are very complex, some are very simple, but their construction took place concurrently, if not a little consecutively, depending on where in the state you were. They each served the same purpose. They opened transportation route for farmers and manufacturers and travelers to get further into the interior of the state. And both businesses competed with these roads in order, same roads of their type, for money because, again, the plank roads were all run by private companies. The railroads, of course, are private companies, and both were in competition with each other for the consumer dollar. In the end, the railroads won out, of course. The plank roads died. But we remember both of them today. We still have roads named for the plank roads. We have the Plank Road Trail that runs from Sheboygan to Fondy. We have a lot of the historic railroads still around, although under different names. The plank roads are now biking trails and walking paths in many places. There are bars and restaurants named for the road, and many of our current highways and streets use the tracks of the old railways and the old plank roads, following in the footsteps of their transportation ancestors. If anybody has any questions, I will be happy to try to answer them. Yes, sir.
I'm fairly new to the state here myself, but I do volunteer at the depot and things and have an interest in putting some of this together. What was the role Where was the military road at this time, when from Fond du Lac out to Portage, I guess? Could that be used by private citizens and crops and
Yeah,
farmers?
the reason they were called military roads is they were paid for by the government, and their initial purpose was to allow the military to get around the state if needed, and for military personnel to get to their units for training.
Okay. So they weren't exclusively government?
They were not exclusively government. As a matter of fact, the road that runs in front of the Wade House, the plank road, originally started as two trails that had been cut by the Native Americans, one going north-south, one going east-west. It eventually became a military road, then just a dirt road, before eventually becoming a plank road. Yes, sir.
Are there any surviving examples of plank roads that are like currently preserved? Or?
There are little bits and pieces here and there. Ulau Road down in Milwaukee, there are certain places where the bike and walking trail sits on a bed of bisque-fired clay. That bisque-fired clay is the base of the plank road. And there are other places that have rebuilt small segments of it just so people can see what it was like. We have about 30 feet that we've rebuilt on the property at Wade House, although ours is much smoother than they really would have been. Yes?
In reference to that hill on the plank road, when they had that locomotive on that, like, it appeared to be that there's some logs on the back of that. Was that the braking system for going down that hill?
A little bit, yep. That and the 40 horses, mules, and oxen in front of it. Have you ever seen the back end of a horse harness where it has a strap that goes across the horse's rear end? That's called a brake. Spelled breech, but it's pronounced brake. And basically part of what that does is as you're going downhill, the wagon or the load pushes forward, and that strap pushes against the back of the animal and helps, the weight of the animal helps keep the load from getting away. Now, I should point out that the original plank road did not go up that hill I mentioned. Today, Highway 23 has been straightened between Sheboygan and Fondy. It used to wind through every town between the two of them. So that is actually the road that the locomotive would have gone on, and that bypassed that hill. One thing I forgot to mention that's very important. Along the plank road, stagecoaches stopped in every town to take on passengers, let passengers off. And pretty much between Sheboygan and Greenbush, they stopped at every bar, because that's where you bought tickets. Yes, sir.
In this competition for the railroad and where they were going to go between these towns, was there corruption, or in Wisconsin did they play it pretty straight up?
Well, now I have another version of this for Ozaukee County and Washington County. And yeah, there was a lot of that down there. I didn't run across too much about it when doing the Sheboygan Fond du Lac version, but I assure you there was some of it there always is. But when you got down to Ozaukee and Washington counties, it was a little blatant.
Is the term corduroy road the same as a plank road?
No. A plank road, as we said, is made with planks. A corduroy road is made with small round logs set into the ground next to each other. So a plank road is supposed to provide a smooth road. A corduroy road, you go pop, 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 pop. I've built one of those, helped build one of those in the past. And,
Precede the
well,
roads, or were they?
the plank roads are probably easier than the corduroy roads because you did dig the corduroy road into the ground. Because otherwise the logs would roll out from under your wheels. But yeah, it's a lot of work, even with trees that are about 4 to 6 inch DBH. You still got a lot of cutting to do. Yes, sir.
Were steamboats ever a significant factor in transportation in Wisconsin during this period you're talking about?
Unfortunately, beyond Lake Michigan, I can't really comment. There was a lot of traffic up and down the western edge of Lake Michigan, but I haven't done any research on that in any other parts of the state. By the way, if there's any total railroad nuts in the audience, The Wisconsin Historical Society website does have an old book scan that you can look through the entire book online, and it literally goes through the state railroad by railroad, year by year, and says, this railroad in this year built from this place to this place to this place to this place. And then it gets to the next year and it starts all over again. It's an incredibly detailed piece of research that I'm sure somebody spent years putting together. And if you're into railroads, it's kind of fun to dig through.
You're missing $90,000.
No, I'm not. I never said I had that.
Is it in your barn someplace or up in the rafters? Or how do you lose 1.5 times what it takes to build the railroad?
You remember that question a minute ago about graft?
Graft among one bank, one person?
The railroad company officials,
Okay.
or excuse me, the Plank Road Company officials took the money and ran in most cases.
If there are any more questions, let's give Jim a thank you for coming.